So today's lesson is entitled The Garment Not to Be Changed. The teachings relating to the priesthood garment or temple garment or garment of the Holy Priesthood as was restored to the Latter-day Saints through the prophet Joseph Smith, and what was taught about its significance by other early Latter-day Saint prophets, and how the garment was not to be changed, but the pattern was originally given by revelation. We're going to cover a lot of important history of the garment and a lot of good statements about the pattern being given by revelation. So there's going to be a lot of good things to cover. So to start off with, Joseph Smith said, "The laws of the Lord are immutable. We must act in perfect compliance with what is revealed to us," as recalled by George A. Smith. And there's many other statements that are very similar to this that Joseph Smith said that you can find in like the history of the church or words of Joseph Smith. So, but I liked how it is phrased in this quote. So, one of the first quotes about the garment that I'm going to use is from Benjamin F. Johnson, recalling Joseph Smith teaching him about the garment and about endowments. He said, quote, "In lighting him to bed one night, Joseph Smith, showed me his garments and explained that they were such as the Lord made for Adam from animal skins," i.e. Genesis 3:21, "and gave me such ideas pertaining to endowments as he thought proper. He told me Freemasonry at the present was the apostate endowments, as sectarian religion was the apostate religion." So the big thing of this quote is that Joseph Smith showed him his garments and said it was the same as Adam was made from animal skins from the Lord, that the Lord made for Adam from animal skins. So this next quote, kind of another scriptural reference to the garments, or what the people in Nauvoo, the leaders, understood were allusions to the garments in the scriptures, besides the reference to them as the coats of skins created um, by God for Adam. We also have the statement where Paul in Galatians 6:17 said that he bore in his body the marks of the Lord Jesus. And so, commenting on that, um, George Miller said, quote, "Paul said he bore in his body the marks of the Lord Jesus Christ, which was as plainly as he dare allude to these things in writing. But the marks Paul alluded to were just such as we now have on our garments." So a quote I like this quote because it's by a non-Brighamite. Ebenezer Robinson was a faithful Latter-day Saint in Nauvoo, but he rejected the Nauvoo teachings of Joseph Smith, such as endowments and plural marriage, etc. And he joined the RLDS church movement and later separated because he felt it was dishonest of them to try to say that Joseph wasn't the originator of those teachings. And so when he was writing his magazine, The Return, in the 1890s, he wrote this about the garment being described to him in Joseph Smith's lifetime. He wrote, quote, "We here state a few facts which came under our personal observation. As early as 1843, a secret order was established in Nauvoo called the Holy Order, the members of which were of both sexes, in which we were credibly informed scenes were enacted representing the Garden of Eden, and that the members of that order were provided with a peculiar undergarment called a robe. It was made in one piece. On the right breast is a square, on the left a compass, in the center a small hole, and on the knee a large hole. This was the description of that garment as given to the writer in Nauvoo in Joseph Smith's lifetime. It was claimed that while they wore this robe, no harm could befall them." So just a good description of the original garment pattern and saying that this pattern was described to him in Joseph Smith's lifetime. So, but then there's this diagram that you'll often see online on the evolution of the temple garment. You have, two different garments that it says start in 1842, kind of a two-piece and a one-piece. And then you see the 1923 garment change that was introduced in 1923, and then you have the 1979 garment change that was introduced. And so just I want to focus on, because people will say, "Oh, this diagram seems to show that there were a variety of garments, or at least two different kinds that were worn in Nauvoo." And so what's up with that? So as we clearly saw from the last quote, the one-piece suit was garment or robe, as they called it. That was clearly described to Ebenezer Robinson in Joseph Smith's lifetime. So I was always curious about what the sources were for this 1842, um, the circa 1842 garment that's a two-piece. And so as I did a lot of research on the history of the garment, I came to realize that there were less than ideal garment patterns used in Nauvoo. And so some of the quotes that I've compiled on this. So John A. Widstow in 1934 recalled that the later shortened garment designs were, quote, much better than the two-piece suits our grandfathers and grandmothers grew up with. So that's kind of interesting in that there weren't two-piece garments being worn by the saints at that time, but he was alluding to the fact that there were two-piece garments that were used in Nauvoo. So the first presidency letter on June 14th, 1923, similarly recalled, quote, in the early history of the church, a garment without collar and with buttons was frequently used. And James Allred's statement on the original garment design also indicated some variety, saying the first garments were made of unbleached muslin and bound with turkey red and were without collars. Later on, the prophet decided he'd rather have them bound with white, and collars were added. So Hiram Smith had a white dress shirt with garment marks cut into pieces of cloth on the inside, which was passed down his family line to Eldred G. Smith. That's in Fred Collier's research journal where he writes a description of that. So this may have been a Nauvoo garment top as referenced in previous statements. These statements, however, do not negate many other statements that the garment pattern was given by revelation from heaven, which is covered in several of the following slides. So it was tactfully admitted in the Nauvoo temple that there were less than ideal garment patterns in circulation being used, but that people should use the proper pattern. So this first quote comes from Joseph Young just prior to the Nauvoo temple's completion. He said, quote, with regard to the garments that you will wear in the house of the Lord, there's no special commandment been given yet. I suppose it would be well to procure bleached muslin, have it in readiness, and wait for further order before you make them up. So then Heber C. Kimball in the Nauvoo temple said, quote, one other thing, you all want to get garments, and you need not wait to get fine linen or bleached cotton for your garments. Shirting or sheeting will do for garments. We don't want you to come here and take up the time to cut your garments. Go to a good, faithful sister, secrete yourselves, and make your garments. We have been crowded too much, and we have got to stop. And if you have cloth, come here and get your cloth cut. We shall keep it here to make use of till we get through. So there was a real shortage of garments in the temple when they were going through the Nauvoo temple. And so Heber C. Kimball was almost saying, if you're going to crowd the temple wanting to have your garments made here, we're going to keep it for our use until we're done giving people endowments in the temple, because they were in a complete rush for getting endowments done. So then Brigham Young said, he said, and that was kind of contradicting what Brigham had said earlier, where Brigham actually counseled for people to bring their cloth to the temple so that it could be cut properly. He said, quote, he, Brigham Young, then observed that there should henceforth have all the cloth which was intended for robes, garments, and aprons brought and either cut or made in this temple under the superintendence of those who know how to do it right. There are now scarcely two aprons alike, nor two garments cut or marked right. It is necessary to observe perfect order in this thing, and it never can be done unless we take this course. So continue, I'm going to read Fred Collier's research journal about Hiram Smith's garment, because this is kind of a less known account of it. So, quote, the garment of Hiram Smith is shown to me by Eldred G. Smith on March 19th, 1973, Monday. And then he draws a rough sketch of it. Collar of garment, navel mark about 2 inches long, which was torn into the clothes. It was not hemmed. Square on the right side breast of garment shirt. This hole was cut into the garment and then patched. Compass on left breast, which was cut into the material and then patched. The cuffs on the sleeves appeared to be gathered as regular modern long sleeve shirts and had buttons on them which were torn off. The reason the holes were so large was because they cut the holes into the material and then turned the edges under for a hem. This garment consisted only of a long shirt. Patriarch Smith told me that Joseph Fielding Smith did not believe that the shirt was Hiram's garment, as Joseph Fielding was of the same opinion as his father, Joseph F. Smith, that the original pattern of the priesthood garment was given by revelations from God to Joseph Smith, with the strings, collar, and all from wrists to ankles. Patriarch Smith said that Joseph Fielding had told him not to show as the garment of Hiram. The shirt had indications of wear, especially in the sleeves, as though it was worn daily by Hiram, too much for just temple use, said Patriarch Smith. So then Fred kind of gives his opinion of it afterwards, saying, I am not certain as to the history of this garment, but I will here give my views. At the time this garment was in use, they had not yet discovered how to make cloth with machines, so clothes was rare and not as easy to come by as today. All clothing had to be sewn by hand. It is possible that in this situation, people were instructed to simply sew the garment marks onto their regular clothes until they could afford to or have time to make the regular priesthood garment. Whatever the case may be, this garment had a split collar and markings which are basically the same as those on the garments worn in the temple today. And it had passed down through Eldred Smith's family that they were Hiram's garments. It is possible also that the shirt of Hiram's was an old shirt, which he wore until he could get garments made according to the pattern of Joseph Smith. So then Fred comments, the statement in the Van Dusen expose of 1847 would indicate that at the time the garment had a mark on the knee which would indicate bottoms. He also mentioned a common shirt which was placed on a person after receiving his garments, which was open at the collar. This would seem to be a good description of the shirt of Hiram's, as was also open the collar with pleats. It is my opinion that the shirt was not Hiram's garment, but was either the shirt placed over the garment, as recalled by Van Dusen, or part of the temple robe, or something Hiram used until he obtained a garment. The shirt might have been the same thing mentioned by John C. Bennett. So John C. Bennett, I believe, mentioned the same thing that Van Dusen talked about there was a garment, a initiation shirt you would wear when going through the endowment, which had the marks cut through the initiation shirt and the garment in the ceremony. And so I think that's a compelling theory that Fred has here, that maybe this was the initiation shirt. But the fact that this was worn daily, that this was kind of not kind of, so the fact that it wasn't just a one-time initiation shirt, but the fact that this seemed to be a regularly worn shirt and it was the marks were cut on the inside and not visible on the outside would kind of indicate that it was intended to be a regular garment shirt. So I lean towards the theory that this was a temporary garment that he was wearing until he could get one made in the ideal pattern. And so there's other people who've kind of described Hiram's garment that had been passed down to Eldred, and another one said that the Eldred had explained that there were bottoms that he did not have that had ties on the bottom of and so that would also lean towards this being an actual garment, a less than ideal garment pattern that was being used by Hiram. So, and then here's kind of Fred's little sketch of it. Kind of a rough sketch where he drew the marks and showed that there was collars and pleats and cuffs on it. Just kind of interesting. But yeah, I wanted to cover this just because I had previously at one time used these pieces of data to kind of argue against there being an ideal pattern. And now I found enough evidence that led me to strongly believe that there is an ideal pattern to the garment, and that these were less than ideal patterns used. So to get into some of those quotes that led me to believe this, a peculiar garment without seam worn by heavenly beings is mentioned in a number of statements, kind of, starting with Oliver Cowdery and talking about the angel's appearance to Joseph Smith to teach him about, to kind of reveal to him the Book of Mormon. So he wrote, quote, on the evening of the 21st of September, 1823, previous to retiring to rest, our brother's mind was unusually wrought up on the subject which had so long agitated his mind. His heart was drawn out in fervent prayer. In a moment, a personage stood before him. The stature of this personage was a little above the common size of men in this age. His garment was perfectly white and had the appearance of being without seam. So you kind of have this theme of a seamless garment. And Heber C. Kimball mentions the same thing in this statement on February 9th, 1862, when he said, quote, so you've got the idea that wool will not do for garments, i.e. only cotton. But let me inform you that when Peter came and sat in the temple in Kirtland, he had on a neat woolen garment nicely adjusted round the neck. What do sheep wear next to their skin? Wool, of course. What do goats wear? Hair, for that is in their nature. These are the facts which are apparent to all who will look. To return to the subject of the garments of the holy priesthood, I will say that the ones which Jesus had on when he appeared to the prophet Joseph was neat and clean, and Peter had on the same kind. So in another statement, Kimball said, I calculate to have my garments of fine wool next fall. I'm aware that some of you have got into your heads that oh that wool won't do for your garments. Will those of you who entertain the idea have the kindness to look at the condition of the Savior was in at the time of his crucifixion? We read that when they had crucified him, quote, they parted his garments, casting lots upon them, what every man should take. The Savior's undergarment was knitted, and Joseph Smith always wore that kind, and therefore I think we have no occasion to be ashamed of homemade garments. So then George A. Smith commented, on the first day of the dedication of the Kirtland Temple, President Frederick G. Williams, one of the Council of the Prophet, and who occupied the upper pulpit, bore testimony that the Savior, dressed in his vestiture without seam, came in the stand and accepted of the dedication of the house, that he saw him and gave him a description of his clothing and all things pertaining to it. So, and this is going to be relevant as when we talk about the ideal garment pattern that was revealed by Joseph Smith. It was to be have as few seams as possible, kind of an imitation or representation of the heavenly pattern. So this is an let's see. I already read this quote by Heber C. Kimball, but the next quote by Wilhelm Weil in Mormon Portraits, it's an antagonistic account, kind of talks about the garment pattern being revealed from heaven. He wrote, quote, Joseph introduced in Nauvoo the endowment garments worn by Adam in paradise and used by every good Utah Mormon day and night. Desdemona Fulmer, one of Joseph's spiritual wives, she died last winter, poor and neglected, made for many years a scant living by making endowment garments after the pattern revealed to brother Joseph by the Lord. So then Zena Y. Card, who's one of Brigham Young's daughters, in an article on garments in 1923, talked about the garment pattern being revealed by revelation to Joseph Smith. She wrote, quote, when Joseph Smith received the endowment and revelation from the Lord to be given to his people by authority, he also received instructions as to how to make this garment. None had ever seen anything like it, and the sisters who made it were under his direction, and when it was submitted to him, he said that it was right and the way it had looked to him, and he accepted it. The garment had a collar and it had strings to tie it and sleeves that came to the wrists, not to the hand, but about an inch above, and the leg came down to the ankle joints. This was the pattern given, and it is right, for Aunt Eliza Snow was the governess and seamstress in his house at the time the first garments were made, and heard the instructions to the sisters. Some people who do not understand this very well will tell you that anything that has been marks placed upon it is a garment of the Holy Priesthood. And some make these marks about like a buttonhole, but they should be about 1 inch each way. But this is false, for you are desecrating our covenants and deceiving yourselves by putting on anything of this kind. And so other quotes go even further, kind of saying that this was revealed by angelic messengers to the prophet Joseph Smith. So the first one's James Allred in his history, recorded by his granddaughter. She recorded him saying, quote, it was while they were living in Nauvoo that the prophet came to James's wife, my grandmother, Elizabeth Warren, who was a seamstress by trade, and told her he had seen the angel Moroni with the garments on, and asked her to assist him in cutting out a garment. They spread unbleached muslin on the table, and he told her how to cut it out. She had to cut out the third pair, however, before he said it was satisfactory. She told the prophet there would be sufficient cloth from the knee to the ankle to make a pair of sleeves, but he told her that he wanted as few seams as possible, and that there would be sufficient whole cloth to cut the sleeves without piercing. The garment was to reach the ankle and the sleeves to the wrist. The marks were always the same. So then John Taylor, as recalled in a statement by S.B. Roundy and copied by N.B. Lundwall, taught, quote, he, Joseph Smith, said it was the pattern of the garment given to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and that it all had sacred meaning. The whole garment to be a covering and a protection from the enemy, the sleeves reaching to the wrists and the legs to the ankle. This pattern was given to Joseph Smith by two heavenly beings. So then Benjamin Franklin LeBaron recalled his mother, Esther Johnson LeBaron, telling him about what she was taught about the garment in Nauvoo. So Mother said she was at the meeting in Nauvoo when he presented the garments to the church and held it up before them and said it was the exact pattern of the one the angel showed him and was called the garment of the Holy Priesthood and must be worn all through life and would be a protection to them against all physical and spiritual danger if they were always faithful to the covenants they made with the Lord. He explained all the features pertaining to it and told them it should never be changed from that pattern. She was so impressed that she made union suits for us children and had us wear them, so we should be used to such a garment when we became eligible to wear it. I've always worn the original garment, the exact pattern of the one an angel showed to Joseph Smith, and I've learned to love it, and I felt very bad when the church authorities allowed a change. He wrote that statement on September 30th, 1940. So then the statement by George A. Smith, as recalled by James Allred, and this is found in the H. Michael Marquardt papers, recalled, quote, the first garments were made by Eliza R. Snow and Zena Huntington Young. They were cut out by the prophet Joseph Smith and under his direction. They then asked him who showed him how, and he said, an angel of the Lord. He stood over them while they were cut out, and he also said the angel Moroni drew aside his robe and showed his marks. There's some other quotes along those same lines, but I thought those were kind of a representative sample of the common quotes about that. And so, but some quotes do kind of indicate that the collar and the strings were design choices. And so here are the quotes that kind of indicate that. So the first one's that from James Allred, where he talks about his wife helping to make some of the early garments. He wrote, quote, the first garments were made of unbleached muslin and bound with turkey red and were without collars. Later, as the prophet decided he would rather have them be bound with white. Sister Emma Smith, the prophet's wife, proposed they have a collar on as she thought they would look more finished. But at first, the prophet did not have the collar on them. After Emma Smith had made the small collars, which were not visible from the outside, then Sister Eliza R. Snow introduced a wider collar of finer material to be worn on the outside of the dress. So then a statement in George F. Richards' diary records a statement by Sister Mariah Dougal saying, quote, Aunt Bathsheba Smith told me that she helped Emma Smith and Aunt Eliza R. Snow make the original endowment clothes for the prophet Joseph Smith. I asked her why they made strings for the garments instead of buttons. She said they were too poor to buy buttons, so they tore strips of the cloth for strings. I asked her the meaning of the collar. She said that in making the garment, they did not know just how to finish them at the top. Emma suggested a small collar be put on, which was done. She said that when the first cap that was made looked like a crown, Prophet Joseph told them it should be more like a baker's cap. So, but to contrast these, yet according to the account of John Taylor's garment description copied by Lundwall, the collar and strings did have sacred symbolism. He taught, quote, it all had a sacred meaning. The collar, my yoke is easy and my burden is light, and the crown of the priesthood. The strings on each side have a double meaning, the strings being long enough to tie into a neat double bow knot representing the Trinity, the bow knot, the marriage covenant between man and wife. So there were three strings that tied the garment, and he felt that that was symbolic of the Trinity, and you tie them into a bow knot would represent the eternal marriage covenant. So, and I think that this quote, I've not been able to track down the original source for this. It's quoted in The Mysteries of Godliness by David Berger. But one thing that I think gives it some credibility is he also explains the symbolism of the marks in this account that's reportedly from explanations in the late 1880s. And it matches some very early explanations of the garment marks. And so I think that gives it some credibility of being an authentic account of what John Taylor taught. So even if the collar and strings were design choices, it seems apparent that the rest of the peculiar aspects of the garment were the revealed pattern, and that those two things do not substantially change it. But if we were to allow innovations in those small things, it seems to be opening the door to the possibility of more serious innovations, as occurred in the other 1923 changes. So to kind of debunk a comment, because some people say, oh, it was just the style of the day. So I've heard that before, that, oh, that was just the the night dress that they wore in that day. That was just the peculiar style that they were wearing at the time. So to contradict that, there's two quotes that I've got where the original garment was not according to the styles of the day. So the first one is from the Xena Y. Card statement, which we already read, where she said, quote, none had ever seen anything like it, and the sisters who made it were under his Joseph's direction. And when it was submitted to him, he said it was right in the way it had looked to him, and he accepted it. So they'd never seen anything like it. The second quote comes from an antagonistic source, and Eliza Young, in her book Wife Number 19, wrote, there is nothing elegant about this garment. On the contrary, it is quite ugly, and the young saints who assume it dislike it terribly for its plainness and awkwardness. In shape, it is like a child's sleeping robe, with the waist and drawers combined, and reaches down from the neck to the feet. It is of white bleached muslin and untrimmed. Latterly, some of the younger daughters of Brigham Young and other young ladies of the Mormon bon ton have instituted a reform, and to the horror of the older ones who are not given over to the pomps and vanities, etc., have had their garments cut short, low to the neck, and short sleeved and elaborately trimmed. Of course, the majority of the people who have known of this innovation have been terribly scandalized, but all to no avail. Mormon girls, like girls of the world, object to making guys of themselves, and neither counsel nor ridicule can affect them when once their minds are made up on the subject of dress. They will suffer that for which they will not for their religion. So, this kind of shows that, this went against the fashions of the day. So I think, and there's other quotes that could be compiled, say, that mention that it was a very peculiar design. So I think that's another thing that kind of lends to it being something revealed from heaven, and that it was a very peculiar thing rather than based on the fashion of the day. So that quote by Annalisa Young kind of alluded to the fact that the older, mature members of the church were opposed to certain youth making innovations in the garments. That they tried to counsel them not to. So there are other early statements and much later statements as well, kind of about how the teaching was that the garment was never to be changed. So an 1879 account of the endowment records the following instructions regarding the garment. So she then told me to put on my garments. These are made in one piece. On the right breast is a square, on the left a compass, in the center a small hole, and on the knee a large hole, which is called the stone. We were told then that as long as we kept them on, no harm could befall us, and that when we changed them, we were not to take them all off at once, but slip out a limb at a time and immediately dive into the clean ones. The neck was never to be cut low or the sleeves short, as that would be patterning after the fashions of the Gentiles. So, very explicit statement there in this expose of the endowment, saying that the temple and garment instructions were, quote, the neck was never to be cut low, nor the sleeves short, as that would be patterning after the fashions of the Gentiles. So, similarly, David H. Cannon recalled that Brigham Young said the garment was not to have the sleeves or collars removed. So this was David Cannon in the St. George Temple Minute Book on December 7th, 1910. He recalled, quote, we are told the garment is a pattern of one given to Adam and Eve in the garden. If the sleeve is cut off, it will not be the proper garment. Said President Young once told a young woman that they could turn in the collar and roll up the sleeves, but they must not cut them off. So in that very clear statement, if the sleeve is cut off, it will not be the proper garment. So continuing, two statements in the 1890s show that Wilford Woodruff also opposed changes to the revealed pattern. The first one comes from the L. John Nuttall Journals on December 8th, 1890. Quote, Sister Zena D. H. Young submitted a knitted garment, something like our garments, which is made in the East, and asked if such could be marked and have a collar put on it and used as our temple garment. It was decided by the First Presidency that such a garment should not be used in lieu of the pattern given. Then in Abraham Cannon's diaries on December 12th, 1895, he wrote, quote, a sample of a knit garments was presented at which was considered too tight. Which were considered too tight. President Woodruff said he could not feel to use any but those similar to the ones which were given him in the endowments. So then Joseph F. Smith, in his day, he really had to deal with, a lot of people starting to push for wanting to change the garment, and he had to very vocally oppose desires to change the garment. So in an article in the Improvement Era in August of 1906, he wrote, quote, The Lord had given unto us garments of the holy priesthood, and you know what that means. And yet there are those of us who mutilate them in order that we may follow the foolish, vain, and permit me to say, indecent practices of the world. In order that such people may imitate the fashions, they will not hesitate to mutilate that which should be held by them to be the most sacred of all things in the world, next to their own virtue, next to their own purity of life. They should hold these things that God has given unto them as sacred, unchanged and unaltered from the very pattern which God gave them. Let us have the moral courage to stand against the opinions of fashion, especially where fashion compels us to break a covenant and so commit a grievous sin. So then, in instructions he gave to bishops circa 1912, I saw another quote say it was 1909, so I'm not sure which year, but it's in development of LDS temple worship. It says, first, the garments worn by those who receive endowments must be white and of the approved pattern. They must not be altered or mutilated and are to be worn as intended down to the wrists and ankles and around the neck. So then in Mormon Hierarchy Extensions of Power on October 18th, 1914, the timeline notes, Joseph F. Smith and Apostle Francis M. Lyman publicly state the undergarments worn by endowed persons outside of the temple, quote, must come up high on the neck and down to the wrists and ankles, for that was the pattern revealed from heaven. So then another article in the Improvement Error in August of 1916, it states, quote, the garments worn by those who receive endowments must be white and of the approved pattern. They must not be altered and mutilated, are to be worn as intended down to the wrists and ankles and around the neck. Admission to the temple will be refused to those who do not comply with these requirements. The saints should know that the pattern of endowment garments was revealed from heaven, and that blessings promised in connection with wearing them will not be realized if any unauthorized change is made in their form or the manner of wearing them. So another thing that kind of contributed to me realizing that this, peculiar original pattern was significant was that even after modified garments were approved in the 1920s, the original pattern was still required in the temple. So this is from the Zena Y. Card statement in 1923. She wrote, quote, the garment to be worn outside of the house of the Lord has been approved by authority, and I have a written statement signed by President Grant to this effect. The garment is not too low in the neck, just a nice modest neck, but with the collar omitted. Instead of being to the wrists, they come to the elbows, and the leg, instead of coming to the ankle, comes below the knee. Always covering the knee so that the mark placed by the Holy Priesthood can come over the knee, for that is where it should be worn. So the thing I like to comment here is that many Latter-day Saints today do not have their garments come to the knees with these styles with these shorter styles. This was opening up the door by shortening it just to come to the knee. It opened up the door to the styles today where the garments don't even come to the knee. But as the statement shows, they intended it to at least cover the knee where the mark needed to be worn. But the fact is that shortening the garment to only come to the knee in practice has led to people wearing, the boxer garments that are in practice today, and just in other cases, women wearing garment sizes bottoms way too short so that they can get away with wearing short shorts is what I recently heard about and was pretty surprised to learn about that cultural practice by some. So continuing, she wrote, this pattern can be worn, and you are not doing anything contrary to the priesthood, but it must be worn only outside this house and cannot be worn in the house of the Lord. So the Heber J. Grant style was not to be worn in the temple. It could only be worn as a street garment. He said, there are two kinds of garments and two only. The one given by the prophet Joseph Smith to be worn in the temple, and the one given by President Grant to be worn outside the house of the Lord. Wear this modified garment, be happy if it adds to your happiness to wear it in this way. So really, if you had to choose between the garment pattern that came from Joseph Smith or the garment pattern that came from Heber J. Grant, which would you honestly choose? So continuing, in 1929, a statement reads, the garment to be used in the temple must be of that which is known as the old style, clean and of white material. So then even clothing the dead, in a statement by the General Board of the Relief Society in February of 1941 states the clothing should be white throughout and scrupulously clean. The garment should be of the old style, approved pattern, properly marked. So then, even as late as the 1960s, and it actually wasn't until 1975 that they finally discontinued requiring the original garment pattern in the temple. So this is in David O. McKay's diaries on February 14th, 1964, writing, quote, all persons going through the temple for themselves or the dead should wear the ceremonial garment. The modified approved style may be worn at any other time. So one thing that's fascinating to learn was that there wasn't unanimity in changing the garment. So both, according to the diaries of Reed Smoot, both Joseph Fielding Smith and George Albert Smith opposed the garment changes introduced in 1923. So Reed Smoot wrote in his diary on May 17th, 1923, attend the meeting at the temple at 10 o'clock. It lasts until 3 o'clock. Among other things decided, it was agreed that certain changes in the Latter-day Saints garments will be allowed. They were as follows: buttons instead of strings, no collar, sleeves above the elbow, a few inches below the knee, and a change in the crotch so as to cover the same. George A. Smith and Joseph F. Smith Jr., so George Albert Smith and Joseph Fielding Smith, were opposed to the change. This action will be approved especially by the women. So kind of funny. They kind of mention this, and this is actually in the Salt Lake Tribune. They kind of say, this is great. The youth are going to love this new change, both the men for their sports and the women for modern fashions, basically. So they really kind of emphasize that this is going to be great for women who want to be according to modern fashions. So statements indicate that Joseph Fielding Smith, throughout his life, continued to wear the original style. And so Cleon Anderson, as a notarized statement on February 24th, 1964, recalling a conversation he recently had with President Joseph Fielding Smith, where he said, I asked President Smith, is it wrong to wear the string tie garments outside of the temple? President Smith looked at me for several moments and then unbuttoned the third button of his shirt, brought out one of the ties on a pair of old style temple garments, and said, this is what we should be wearing. The Lord gave them to us, and so this is what I wear. So to get into later garment changes, because there's quite, Heber J. Grant in 1923 opened up the floodgate, which, didn't really take off until the 1970s under Spencer W. Kimball. But then nowadays, you just hear about changes every couple of years, unfortunately. So in 1975, under Spencer W. Kimball, the Heber J. Grant garment style started being approved for wearing in the temple, and the original style of garment started being phased out. And there's actually a statement where Spencer W. Kimball said, "Don't order any more of the old style garments for use in temples." So then 4 years later, in 1979, Kimball introduced the two-piece garment styles. So sometime in the mid 1900s, possibly the 1970s, garment marks started being exclusively sewn rather than being cut into the garments as was originally. In 2018, garment marks began to be printed in ink for most fabrics, making the marks even less noticeable to the wearer. They still have sewn marks on a couple different garments designs where it isn't practical to print the ink on them. So then promises of divine protection provided by faithfully wearing the garments and keeping endowment covenants has been de-emphasized in recent years, where they kind of tried to deny that the garment was intended to have spiritual or physical protection. That was just, quote, a reminder of your covenants. So modern cultural shifts with garment practices among LDS church members continue to minimize them as a standard for modesty. In the 2020s, it has been noted that it's common among youth to forgo wearing garments in spite of numerous style changes for convenience. It is common among members today for their garment legs to no longer cover the knee as originally intended, even with the shorter bottoms. And it's common for women to wear garment bottoms several sizes too short in order to be able to wear short shorts with their garments. So accommodating these cultural changes, the church announced in 2024 the first approved sleeveless garment styles to be available in 2025. And now sleeveless dresses are now starting to be seen in LDS meeting houses and temples. And it's kind of a culture shock for some people to see that. Well, in contrast with those who are, in favor of modern fashion, there's currently, I understand, a black market of sorts where these garments are available in other countries in hotter climates already. And so people who are traveling to those countries will buy them in bulk and bring them back here and kind of sell them at, you know, multiple times what the cost was to buy them. And there are people who really want to get their hands on, the new design, and it's very kind of unfortunate that you start to permit some changes in the design, and it's led to where we are today with the garment changes and the garment being in some ways de-emphasized and many youth not even caring about garments anymore. So what's interesting is that under Heber J. Grant, there was even discussions about doing away with garments outside of temples. And I've got two different sources that kind of tell this story. So this is in Leonard J. Arrington's diaries on June 22nd, 1972, where he recorded, quote, "At dinner, I sat next to Homer Durham with interesting conversation. I asked him if he ever heard his father-in-law, Dr. John A. Widstow, tell about the controversy in the Quorum of the Twelve in regard to whether temple garments should be worn only in the temple or also outside the temple. Said Dr. Widstow had never discussed it with him, but he'd heard the full story from Franklin L. West, who was a professor of physics at USU and the LDS Church's Commissioner of Education. It appears that sometime in the late 1920s or early 1930s, the Quorum of the Twelve had discussed this matter and had finally concluded that garments were designed to be worn only in the temple. Brother Joseph Fielding Smith was not satisfied with this decision and returned to the next meeting saying that he had a manifestation that the decision was wrong and that temple garments should be worn at all the time. He presented this matter so strongly and earnestly that apparently the decision was reversed, and we have the policy which has continued to the present." So then in the book, Development of LDS Temple Worship, in a footnote in the introduction, he cites a conversation with George T. Boyd on July 3rd, 1986, and he was a church educator, as I understand, a CES educator. He records, quote, "According to a church educator whose brother-in-law was in the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, the quorum once discussed doing away with garments altogether except when inside the temple. The idea originated with Apostle Melvin J. Ballard, according to the second-hand account, whose wife found the garments uncomfortable." So pretty unfortunate, and it'd be interesting if that conversation eventually happens again among church leaders due to many youth not really, wanting to wear the garment nowadays. But it'd be interesting in as much as the church has, they made all the modifications they have trying to emphasize still wear the garments as, it's represent, you're wearing, the marks represent Christ, the garment represents Christ and the veil of the temple, etc. So, if the church were to do that, which, would be something I'd be surprised at, but it is always a possibility that they could go that far based off of the cultural shifts and the changes to the garments. I want to cover just two different stories relating to the garment to kind of end the story about Joseph removing his garment before Carthage, and then also Willard Richards being kind of promised by Joseph Smith that he would, if he wore his garment faithfully, he would have a miracle where he would survive and without being shot in a situation where balls were being shot all around him in a firefight. So, with Joseph removing his garment before Carthage, in discussing why Joseph and Hiram were not wearing their garments at the time of their death, W. Phelps recalled a conversation where, quote, "Joseph told him one day about that time that he had laid aside his garment on account of the hot weather. In that same meeting, Heber C. Kimball recalled that about the time of the martyrdom, that, quote, word came to him and to all the 12 about that time to lay aside their garments and take them to pieces or cut them up so that they could not be found. John Taylor also commented on them not wearing their garments on the day of the martyrdom, saying, the minutes record, quote, Elder John Taylor confirmed the saying that Joseph and Hiram and himself were without their robes in the jail at Carthage, while Willard Richards, had his on, but corrected the idea that some had, that they had taken them off through fear." So a later account by Oliver B. Huntington recorded John Taylor during the 1880s giving his explanation in more detail. So Oliver B. Huntington wrote, quote, among other things, both new and old was repeated the fact that the prophet Joseph pulled off his garments just before starting to Carthage to be slain. He advised Hiram and John Taylor to do the same, which they did. And Brother Taylor told Brother Willard Richards what they had done and advised him to take off his also. But Brother Richards said he would not take his off and did not, and he was not harmed. Joseph said before taking his garments off that he was going to be killed, was going as a lamb to the slaughter, and he did not want his garments to be exposed to the sneers and jeers of his enemies. These facts all came from President John Taylor's lips after he was president of the church. Elder John Morgan had told them to me, as stated to him by Brother Taylor. Sister Lucy B. Young said that Brother John Taylor told her in answer to direct questions the same, except with regards to Willard Richards. So basically, the two different sources he said that told him that John Taylor said that Joseph told him the reason he took off his garments before going to Carthage was so that the garments would not be exposed to the sneers and jeers of their enemies. So, yet Joseph prophesied Willard Richards would be protected by the garment. So, this prophecy is recalled by Brigham Young in several different places. I'm just going to quote this probably most complete account of it on July 14th, 1861, where he said, quote, here sits Elder Taylor, John Taylor, into whom they shot 4 balls. They shot him all to pieces, and Willard Richards dragged him around into one of the cells to save him from being entirely used up. I recollect a promise Joseph gave to Willard at a certain time when he clothed him with a priestly garment. I believe my personal strong opinion of this was this occurred at the end of May 1843 when they renewed their endowments in the anointed quorum. And at that time, Joseph made comments praising Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball's characters as being the only two of the apostles who had never lifted a heel against him or spoke, or had ever turned against him. So, and so if I were to, I think that belong, if I was the one working on the history of the church, I would have put this in the account of that anointed quorum meeting. So said he, Willard, never go without this garment on your body, for you will stand where balls will fly around you like hail, and men will fall dead by your side. And if you will never part with this garment, there never shall a ball injure you. I heard him say that, and the voice in the stand, probably Heber C. Kimball, said, so did I. It is true, when the mob shot Joseph, Willard was there, and Brother Taylor was in the room. I have nothing to say about the rest. You know about it. Willard obeyed the word of the prophet. He said, I will die before I part with this garment. The balls flew around him, riddled his clothes, and shaved a passage through one of his whiskers. And one quote says that he had his earlobe was grazed as well. Yet he was not harmed, he was not shot. And so this was considered a fulfillment of the prophecy of Joseph Smith. So this prophecy shows up early in church history in the original version of section 135 of the Doctrine and Covenants, included in the 1844 edition. The 1876 edition of the D&C by Orson Pratt changed promises of God to providence of God. Then finally, the 1921 edition under Heber J. Grant removed the quotation marks that indicated the verse was quoting a special prophecy. So kind of two accidental changes, in my opinion, that kind of lost this earliest reference to the prophecy by Joseph Smith that Willard would be preserved by wearing his garment or robe. So you can see how it's written in the today, where it says John Taylor and Willard Richards, 2 of the 12, were the only persons in the room at the time. The former was wounded in a savage manner with 4 balls, but has since recovered. The latter, through the providence of God, escaped without even a hole in his robe. So in the original, it says John Taylor and Willard Richards, 2 of the 12, were the only persons in the room at the time. The former was wounded in a savage manner with 4 balls, but has since recovered. The latter, through the promise of God, escaped, then in quotes, without even a hole in his robe. So pretty significant early prophecy there. And you can kind of see how it got changed textually. And this is from the 1880 edition of the Doctrine and Covenants, where it changed promises to providence, but still has in quotation marks without even a hole in his robe. And so then finally the 1920 or 1921 edition of the D&C under Heber J. Grant, you could see changes it through the providence of God, escaped without even a hole in his robe. So I think these were just accidental changes, but I think it's a shame that these accidental changes lost the earliest prophecy, the earliest account of the prophecy of Joseph Smith telling Willard Richards that wearing his garment he would um, escape without even a hole in his robe from violence. So. Just to end on two quotes, this is from George A. Smith in the Nauvoo Temple. He said, quote, "When we pray to the Lord, we ought to come together clad in proper garments. And when we do so and unite our hearts and hands together and act as one mind, the Lord will hear us and will answer our prayers. Our garments should be properly marked, and we should understand those marks, and we should wear those garments continually by night and by day, in prison or free. And if the devils in hell cut us up, let them cut up the garments to pieces also." And then this last quote I'm going to end on is actually scripture from Matthew 22:11 through 14. "And when the king came in to see the guests, he saw there was a man which had not on a wedding garment. And he saith unto him, Friend, how camest thou into hither without not having a wedding garment? And he was speechless. Then said the king to the servant, Bind him hand and foot, and take him away, and cast him into outer darkness. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth, for many are called, but few are chosen." I hope that we can learn to cherish the endowment ceremony as was originally revealed through the prophet Joseph with its covenants, which are to bless us and exalt us, and through the clothing which is sacred and revealed from God. And though I hope that we all have a wedding garment, as the parable says. And I say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.